get started, please? There we got a mic. Good afternoon. If you could take your seats and quiet down, we'll start our next panel. My name is Mark Plant. I'm a policy fellow here at the Center for Global Development, and I'm pleased to introduce this panel on evidence-based action for growth. And the moderator is Shruti Rajagopalan from George Mason University. Shruti, I turn the floor over to you, and I'll try to quiet the crowd outside. Go ahead.
I'm supposed to wait for someone to tell me if the mic is on.
Your mic is on.
Oh, excellent. For those of you who are still outside, this is a good time to step in because these are the very best of the people here, right?
Absolutely.
Excellent. Thank you so much for being here. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks to everyone at CDG, Growth Teams, Charter Cities Institute, all our colleagues here. It's really, really wonderful to be here. Today, we're going to talk about evidence-based action when it comes to growth, and I have really a stellar panel. I have Ileana Carranza, who's an economist and is the global lead for labor and skills at the Social Protection Unit at the bank. I have Amir Labdoui, who's the Associate Professor of Political Economy of Development and the Director of the Technology and Industrialization for Development at Oxford. I have Ken Opalo, who is the Associate Professor at the Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown. He's also faculty member of the African Studies program and writes one of my favorite Substacks, which is the Africanist Perspective. We have Kunal Sen, who is an economist and currently serving as the director of UNU Wider, and he's currently on leave from the Global Development Institute at the University of Manchester, where he's a professor of development economics and has written some of my favorite books on economic growth, episodes in India, informal markets, post-reform periods, and So I'm very, very excited to kick off this conversation. Before we get into your long remarks, I just want to hear a hot take from each of you. And I'd like to start with, in your perspective, which policies have proven most effective in driving or spurring economic growth and which ones haven't, or worse still, have hindered growth?
Okay.
I told you, this is a good one.
I believe that we understand much better what doesn't work for growth than what works for growth. In part because also, there is a bit of complexity when we think about what are the policies that are suitable for different countries in different stages of development. They have different institutional capacity, and they have different economic environments, right? So the answer has to be very, very nuanced. But I would say that in general, we have learned that anything that is market-friendly and business-friendly, trade policy, investment, are kind of like the pillars, right? And in terms of what we know doesn't work, that the list is much, much longer, right? Like protectionism, over-regulation of markets, price controls, subsidies that do not have an exit strategy, poorly targeted programs, and it can go on, right?
Yeah. First off, thank you for having me here today. I'll disagree a little bit in the spirit of disagreement on the panel by saying that I think in terms of what works, the things that I've seen to work best are policies that have specific beneficiaries in mind, so that you have policy coalitions that can then sustain the reform drive or policy initiative. So if you're trying to make pro-business policies, right? What specific sectors are you trying to promote? And specifically, what leading firms are you trying to promote? Because then they'll tell you that actually your tariff is too high or too low. So you'll have a feedback mechanism with an actual sector or set of firms that can give you feedback for improvement. But if all you're doing is improving your business environment in the abstract without anyone in mind, then you'll have the Malawi problem that we heard about, which is you make all these nice reforms, but the private sector doesn't show up because there's no private sector to think about. So maybe thinking more about where states can come in to help catalyze these demanders of good policy, so that we don't only see this problem as a problem of supply of good policy, but also making sure that we have enough demand coalitions that can then sustain the growth process once we've jump-started it.
Kunal?
So I think, in part, I'm going to overlap with Ken, actually, because I think what does not work And I think it's pretty clear the evidence on this, one has to say, even though it's still promoted quite a bit in discussions on growth, is essentially big bang investment climate reforms, trying to do everything, trying to strip down regulation, hoping that if the country moves from ease of doing business from whatever 50th rank to 30th rank, it's going to make a big difference in growth. Doesn't work. So that's pretty much what doesn't work, even though that's still exactly often what we hear policymakers have to listen to from many others, that's what you're going to do. Got to get your ease of doing business ranking down if you can. What works? Exactly the opposite. You got to essentially create microclimate of deals between economic actors, firms, and political elites, which are kind of sort of, you create this microclimate where the right deals are given to the right kind of firms, right? You find the right firms, tradable for services, whatever it is, and create the microclimate and more sectoral targeted development policies. This is not industrial policy. Yeah. Not industrial policy. It's not industrial policy because we have weak state capacity. So states cannot essentially monitor performance here, but it's not industrial policy. I want to be careful about that. But it is a kind of industrial policy, right? That works, and we have many examples of why that has worked.
So if you ask what policy works, the one that I would choose would be the one that my good friend Reda Sharif over there used to call the policy that shall not be named. That thankfully is not the case anymore, so we can say it openly. Industrial policy, but with a caveat. Industrial policy with a high tolerance for failure, right? And in fact, this morning, or actually earlier in the session, Mike Tyson was mentioned in the introduction session. And even Mike Tyson lost some games, no? So the whole point here is that there is a great process of learning by doing, even institutionally, right? In terms of trying things, seeing what doesn't work, adapting it over time. And this is something that has often been lost in kind of appreciating what grows for growth, right? There might be many things that don't work, and it's that learning that gets us there. And I hope that Lent talks about isomorphic mimicry in his next session, because in terms of recipes, I think commonality between countries that have grown is exactly this, actually. It's actually trying things that don't work, but actually adapting it over time to the local context. And if you don't actually try it, you'll never learn, right? You'll never know how to actually get there. So this is perhaps my take on growth that might be similar to what a life coach advice might be. Yeah.
No, this was great. Now, I just want to dig in a little bit more into some of your research. So Ileana, recently in your Journal of Economics Perspective piece with McKinsey, you've talked about government training programs, sort of reducing market frictions, job skilling, job search and matching, and how these sorts of government policies have limited effectiveness. But a very large part of the structural transformation problem that most developing countries face is exactly that churn in the labor market and how to increase wages. So is there a role for any policy? Is it just that they're implementing the wrong policies? Is there a right one? Or this is just part of one of those policies that they must do because they're democratic countries and then actually something else ends up working altogether?
No, I understand. And I don't want my words to be taken, out of context. So I want to start by saying that I believe that, like economic growth is key for job creation. And in many countries, it's still the main constraint to job creation. But there are like many other countries where even when they have economic growth, they are not producing enough jobs for the rates of growth that they are exhibiting. And here what we are starting to understand is that it's not only that growth matters, but how that growth occurs, what are the type of transformations that happen on the background of it matter for job creation, right? And we are talking about transformations along, on a spatial dimension, sectoral dimension, occupational dimension, and even organizational dimension on how firms work. And that is where we see, the space for microeconomic policy, both on the supply and the demand side, such as industrial policy that has been mentioned here, but also these type of training programs and labor market intermediation programs to enable the type of transitions that will lead to, the structural transformation processes that we know are more conducive to create jobs, right? And we know, for example, that that's the difference between what we observe when we look at Korea or Indonesia or India. That per each, 1% of GDP growth, like they have created, more or less jobs, particularly low-skill jobs. So I would say that what we are trying to convey in this study then is that it's in that context where we have to think what is the appropriate role for this type of policies. And not only the appropriate role and space for this type of policies, but the appropriate role for the public sector or the private sector in providing many of these, if you want, enabling services, right? Like the skilling of the workforce, the connecting employers with workers, et cetera. And so I do think that, for me, one of the most interesting things, to come across when we were preparing this review, it was really it's not a meta-analysis, it's an expert opinion piece. And it was, how we have perfected the tools that we use to intervene in the labor market on the supply side. So we have tools that are becoming increasingly effective, increasingly even cost-effective, and yet still the challenge is scaling up their impacts, right? And so much of the reflection that went into this piece is what is limiting the scaling up if we know what works, right? And part of the answer is that it's not only about the tool, it's about how we package this tool together with other interventions in order to achieve certain type of labor market outcomes, right? So we do need approaches that are more comprehensive and oftentimes that require coordinated cross-sectoral policies, and that's part of the challenge. The other part of the challenge is that, as some of our panelists have mentioned, the policies that are the most effective are the policies that are tailored. Like with labor market approaches, it's not like giving a pill and the same pill to everybody. Oftentimes the approaches, the solutions that are developed, particularly at a smaller scale by private sector, by NGOs, are solutions that have been tailored to a specific type of sector, to a specific profile of worker, in a specific area. And that is why they are able to be highly effective. So the challenge then when you try to scale up these approaches is that it's not only about increasing the coverage of the programs, but you are also increasing the heterogeneity of beneficiaries that you are trying to reach with the same policy. And actually, in the context of labor markets, if we want to maintain certain level of effectiveness at a large scale, what we need to do is both to increase the numbers, but at the same time maintaining this tailoring approach. And that requires very sophisticated delivery systems, very complex delivery systems that allow you to expand, while at the same time profiling different type of participants and giving them the type of supports that they need. No? So I do see that on the technical space, in the innovation space, there is a lot of micro evidence that is really exciting, but now the challenge is scaling up and building systems to approach this problem, because right now the solutions that have been quite successful are boutique solutions.
Can you give some examples of that? The kinds of solutions that have been successful and could potentially be scaled?
So let me tell you so that you understand a bit the disconnect that sometimes there is between this very exciting micro evidence and where the challenges are, right? For me, we know that in these countries, entrepreneurship and self-employment is one of the dominant activities of the labor force, right? And in this space, there are like several interventions, that are trying to give people business training with mixed success, et cetera. Very recently, some of the most exciting work that has emerged is, some sort of interventions that are more like giving people soft skills, okay? Like the entrepreneurs, they are giving them soft skills. This with the idea that in developing countries, many of these entrepreneurs are entrepreneurs due to push factors as opposed to pull factors, which means that their unobservable characteristics are not the ones of a typical entrepreneur in a first world country, okay? And then, you have to reinforce this type of more entrepreneurial mindset or attitudes in this population. The results have been beautiful. Probably is one of the most encouraging, pieces of research in terms of impacts of, soft skills training on entrepreneurial outcomes. Oftentimes much better than, business training, much better even than capital injections, etc. But can you imagine a national policy that only emphasizes that feature?
Yeah.
So, and here is where, we need to think about granularity and complexity and etc.
Yeah, this actually, there's a lot of overlap. Some of the questions on female labor force participation, entrepreneurship that both of you worked on. But Ken, I have a slightly different question for you. I want to actually go to one of my favorite pieces you've written, which is titled 2 Unsolicited Ideas on How to Invest Some of Melinda French Gates's $12.5 billion on Substack. So this is a really lovely essay by you. And one of the things that struck me the most is you talk about how little innovation there has been in international development in the community, and how we just need more experimentation. A lot of it needs to be more focused on the private sector and so on. So can you first lay out the argument there, and then if you were the czar of that, international development community and the Gates Foundation, what would you do? How would you allocate the funds?
So yeah, I think the piece was partially motivated by, I'm working on a project trying to look at Kenya's changing approaches to development policy over time. And what's clear is that, in the development community, those of us who are academics or development practitioners who don't interface much with the private sector. And so what we do is not private sector oriented. And I see this in my master's classes all the time. When I survey the students, they rarely mention the private sector. And so I try to prod them to think about the private sector as the driver of development, right? And so you would imagine that philanthropists, many of whom make their money in the private sector, right, would be the ones who, when they show up in the field of development, should be trying to reproduce mini Bill Gates in the tropics, right, as it were. But we're not seeing that, right? They are coming in and they want to be the World Bank and to do the same sort of things that the traditional development outfits do. And I think that's sort of an interesting approach, right? They have the entrepreneurial spirit, right? So that you'd imagine that they would be interfacing with fellow successful business people in the developing world and helping them scale up, right? Instead of trying to give microloans for unemployed low-income women to start their own businesses, right? So that was the puzzle, right? And the challenge here should be that those who do business and understand the private sector should be interfacing with the private sector on the other side, instead of putting on a straitjacket of wanting to only do that through the paradigm of international development. Because then, they would be free to innovate, right? Mm-hmm. Instead of, pretending that they know nothing about how business works, right? They could show up and say, you have a small business with 50 employees. Here are ways that I can help you get to 500 employees, right? And I'm going to try and replicate some of the things I've done in my own economy because I understand how the private sector works. Maybe the Manufacturers Association in Tanzania is not as well organized, right? Here's the way we've done it in my country. Here's how you can get organized to demand. And maybe I can use my influence as a Gates Foundation to ensure that the government listens to your demand as a Manufacturers Association in a developing country context. And so, I think that's where the innovation ought to be coming from, right? Instead of, forgetting all the business experience and knowledge and coming in to hire academics who've never run a business to, go study how to succeed at this, right? I think there's a lot that we're leaving on the table by adopting this approach, in my view.
Yeah, academics actually, international development should be merged with the business school, I think. They also get paid better. So maybe we can get a coalition going for that. Another, Substack of yours, which I really found fantastic, is you're talking about how development policy at the national level oftentimes has, this is where the politics really kicks in, right? And especially at lower stages of development, there isn't enough to compensate those who may be preventing these reforms or transitions. And your focus in that piece was on urbanization, I think in Nigeria particularly, and how as a second best, I don't even like using the word second best, but how focusing on urbanization and maybe getting 1 or 2 cities to really become the engines of development may be the way to go. How would you fit that in with the private sector idea? I feel like there's a lot of complementarity, but I haven't quite figured out how to put them together.
Yeah, so in the piece, right, the idea there is the learning by doing sort of story, and perhaps also it reflects a bit of my frustrations with how we've conceptualized the institution's literature, right? The idea that, get perfect so you can grow, that's not how things have worked in history. You get perfect as you go on the institutional front. So if Nigeria can't be good at national level policy making, right, the second best thing, if I may use that phrasing, right, could be to try and decentralize this sort of public service at the city level and have, policies that create cities almost as their own autonomous units that can help, one, produce the right kind of urbanization that's not just dense ruralization, if I can say that term, which I think is a problem for many African countries, right? The cities don't look and feel like cities because they're not well organized. And so we're not getting the benefits of urbanization that other regions or other cities in Africa have seen in the past. So that could be one sort of benefit. And the other benefit would be to allow the cities, right, to cater to their own local private sectors, right? So that you have this symbiotic relationship between the public sector and the private sector in a more localized setting. So that if you're doing, grain or whatever in the middle belt in Nigeria, you have your own policy, as opposed to the cities in the southeast that care more about light manufacturing, or Lagos with their financial services, right? So you can decentralize the public sector, if you will, in this fashion, without dragging everything back, because you also have to worry about the rural sector, which is a big problem for the federal government and the state governments in Nigeria.
Yeah. Kunal, it was hardest for me to ask you the question because I've read so much of your work on the episodes of, the different episodes of India's growth story. But the one thing I really want to learn from you about is when it comes to structural transformation, politics really matters. And so usually we're talking at the level of development policy, right? But development policy is informed by politics of that particular context or that particular country or city or whatever it may be. Can you talk a little bit about how politics plays a role in structural transformation, and maybe how some of the more recent country examples are a little bit different from what happened maybe 40, 50 years ago in the case of the Asian tigers?
Yeah, it's really important because we talked in the morning about globalization, infrastructure, et cetera, which are all very important. Obviously, these are enabling factors, right? You can't really have growth if you don't have infrastructure and if you don't open up the world markets. But I think the point is, and I think that's another work that we did also with land, is that underlying all that is the politics, right? And again, when you think about growth, we need to be careful that growth has sort of two parts to it, right? There's one part which is getting the growth started, acceleration of growth. And then the part that, okay, you got growth started, how do you maintain growth? What we know is many countries get growth started and that growth is not maintained. So we have the growth spurts, there's boom and bust growth, and growth simply collapses, right? That's like one of the most, I think, clear science facts of economic growth we know now, that work we did, Platt and I did many years back. But then the question is, okay, so why is it that very few countries get growth started? They get growth started, but they can't maintain growth. What's the problem here? You got your investment going, you got some growth going, maybe a little bit of productivity increases, but then you just can't maintain growth. And that's where the politics comes in, right? So generally, the way one can think about how growth gets started in a fairly simple kind of formulation is some political elites find some business actors and say, look, guys, you want to invest, I'm going to make sure that you're going to get the credit deals that you need, and growth gets started. Bad institutions, business regulation, nothing, all of that is not going to be there, right, in this kind of context. And growth gets started. Some people get this kind of deals, and they start investment, and then that happens. But then the next big step is, so that's what we call closed deals, which are offered to only particular agents, enterprises in the economy. And these are ordered because the political elites are said to the economic actors, we're going to look after you. Don't worry about it. We're around here to look after you as long as you manage to make some investments. But then the next stage is, okay, you got that going, but for growth to be maintained, you need structural transformation. You cannot have growth maintenance if you don't have structural transformation. And that means new actors, new firms, new entrants, and also perhaps some incumbents who need to get out because they're simply not productive anymore. And that movement from starting off with a few firms that political elites are favoring to opening up the deal space to a lot more firms, so opening up the deal space into new entrants, maybe tradable firms, maybe manufacturing, and so on, is a difficult one. Why? Because once you got this rent-seeking arrangement with a few firms, you want to maintain that. You're getting a rents. Why would you want to disturb it? From both sides, from both enterprises, for getting this rents, corruption, cronyism, whatever, and from the political elite side. So it's kind of difficult to actually open up the deal space. And so that transition is a very difficult transition. And the work we did on this shows that in many countries, growth started, but that transition to open deals, opening up the deal space, was very difficult. A couple of country examples. So the work we did, we found Rwanda and Bangladesh. I'll give two examples. Rwanda was a very different political context, at least in that time we were working on this. Rwanda, dominant political settlement, still now. And in that kind of, in the Rwanda story, the political elites favored few coffee producers, saw some potential there, provided them the deals. And Rwanda, as we know, has seen growth and structural transformation in a limited way, but still structural transformation. So there was the Rwanda story. In Bangladesh, what we had was two competing elites, both jockeying for power. And of course, until one set of elites decided to keep the power to themselves, until recently. But both sets of elites, as far as you could see, were offering the same kind of deals to the ready-made garment sector. So whether the one set of elites went off and somebody else came in, the ready-made garment sector knew it didn't really matter. We will get our deals, we're going to make sure we're going to get whatever we wanted, and we will be protected. And of course, Bangladesh is an example of a story of a country which had growth with some semblance of sectoral transformation. Okay, at the end of the day, there was a limit to what you can achieve with a ready-made garment sector-driven strategy. But certainly, Bangladesh certainly managed growth with such transformation. So in both examples, very different political contexts. One, very dominant, one set of elites. Another, competing elites jockeying for power, but similar outcomes. And similar in the way that they handle that transition from very closed deals, slightly more opening of the deal space. So I think that's a really important thing to understand in how structural transformation happens.
To what extent does the momentum that comes from economic growth generates more revenue and also more rents in some sense, and allows the political elite to start buying out more of the incumbents or more people who are sort of maybe in agriculture or somewhere else who are resisting reforms in some sense? So to solving the transitional gains trap, you need some money to go around, right? So how does that transition work out? Because there are sectors in developing countries where you don't have these kind of entrenched incumbents, but there's still some friction in having reforms, typically agriculture.
Well, I think it's a difficult one. So again, let's take two country examples. Let's take Malaysia and Thailand. Both have done actually pretty well, but they're still middle-income countries, and they haven't made the transition, the middle-income trap, as we obviously call it. Now, in those two countries, and you'd have thought, okay, Malaysia and Thailand, look what they're doing. They're getting all this electronics and everything going. What can stop them, right? but something stopped them, and that was the politics, right? So in those two countries, and simplifying the story a little bit, basically they could provide these open deals to the manufacturing sector, electronics, auto ancillaries in Thailand and Malaysia electronics. But at the same time, they had a whole bunch of political elites, so they had to, a bunch of indigenous elites, so they had to keep happy, or groups of very powerful conglomerates that they had to keep happy. In the case of Thailand, powerful conglomerates. In the case of Malaysia, indigenous elites. And so you had to keep them happy, and then you had to provide them chronistic deals, because you didn't want them to shake the political settlement. And that's the problem here, that even in those two countries with pretty high state capacity, with pretty good growth going, even there was a point where they could not maintain it. And then we know what happened. The East Asian financial crisis was not just an exogenous shock, it was very endogenously outcome of a lot of the politics, right? And since then, neither of these two countries have done very well, right? They haven't really gone back to where they were before. So it's a difficult one. I think that's the problem that of this transition is very difficult. There are other examples where the transition has been handled. South Korea, of course, is one key example there. But it is surprising that where there are very few countries that even at different levels of economic development, the transition to what you said, towards this more inclusive deals, and opening up the space for new entrants and so on, isn't really possible. And that, I do think, is to do with the politics.
Yeah. I want to switch gears and go to Amir. Amir, so the conventional wisdom when it came to developing countries was the important thing is just to grow and industrialize, right? Don't worry too much about first world problems like climate change. Don't worry too much about air pollution and other things. And as countries get richer, there is a demand for those sorts of, clean air, clean water, and there are also enough revenue generated to solve those problems, technology, and that's when you deal with it. And you sort of, in some sense, flip that on its head, in that developing countries need to think about more climate-friendly technologies, more sustainable technologies, because that's part of the package of what is preventing them from growing in the first place, right? How does this square with your other view on trade protectionism, also hampering, developing countries, or the inability to do industrial policy, which is also strongly linked with these kinds of climate, clean climate technologies and everything that you're talking about. So, what is a good way to think about all these different pieces together?
Thanks. Actually, that book that you referred to, Survival of the Greenest,
Yes.
is published in the same series as Kunal's, and there are two main arguments for reading our books. One is that they're open access. Two, they're only 100 pages long, which means that you can read them and you don't waste time and you don't waste money, right? Which are very good arguments.
I'll add a third, they're actually very good.
Yeah. It's an added benefit.
Are they both wider?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes, the same series.
So let me start with a very pessimistic view, right? And the one is in terms of the climate agenda and how it impacts structural transformation. So there is a perception that the climate agenda brings about a lot of benefits, right, for everyone, for growth. And in theory, it's true, and it's actually the main point of the work, right, to show that actually, in many ways, now the best or the most viable industrialization is green industrialization, given changing conditions, changing demand. But in practice, what you see is that those opportunities for green growth are being increasingly captured by already industrialized economies. And that's a real problem, right? Because the green growth agenda is not delivering growth where it's the most needed. So if you look at jobs, which I think is Eliana, what you work on, if you look at the manufacturing of low carbon technologies, if you look at green patents, they're consolidated even more so than standard manufacturing in 2-3 countries. For a lot of the opportunities for green industrialization, whether it's energy-intensive industries downstream, but also a lot of the tech, they hinge on the existence or access to cheap, reliable, and clean energy. Now we're seeing record investment in renewables every year, right? Over $1 trillion. If you put it in per capita terms, that's about $180 per capita for North America, excluding Mexico, 140 for the EU, 120 for Japan, Guess what's the number for Sub-Saharan Africa?
10.
10. Who says better? So, and this is the region where you have great potential for renewables. I think Vera mentioned this morning all the minerals you need, and you still have 600 million people that still lack access to electricity. The number is $1 per capita, right? $1 per capita. So under these conditions, the poorest are going to be pushed even further behind, right? And clearly, they're not getting the investments that they need to achieve that green structural transformation. And that's a real source of concern. So, you know what they say, the pessimists complain about the direction of the wind. The optimists will hope that it changes, and the sailors try to adjust their sail, right? And this is where industrial policy comes in, right? Because this is precisely a way to not see the climate agenda as a green window of opportunity, but seeing as, well, a wave that can be appropriately leveraged to actually get to where you want to be. And that's the core of industrial policy, right? It's about changing the conditions, the incentive structure, to reorient flow of resources where they're the most needed or where they can have the most multiplier effects. So in terms of how to get there, I would like to focus about the issue of coordination that is needed at 3 levels: at the national level, at the regional level, and at the international level. So at the national level, one thing that is really different about, well, green growth strategy in general, but also the implementation of green industrial policy, is the amount of coordination you need across different types of ministries and actors, right? The examples that were also mentioned in the previous session of the East Asian Miracle, these are examples where industrial policy was the main mandate of the powerful Ministry of Industry and Trade. But with green industrial policy, that is just not possible, right? Because for the first time, you really need key coordination with the Ministry of Energy as well, because if you have a discrepancy between your energy policy and the industrial policy, you can't have a green industrial policy. The Ministry of Environment, because many countries actually use environmental regulations, not so much for the environment, but as a way to have a de facto import constraint, right? So, by the way, can you raise your hand if you think that bicycles are not environmentally friendly? And can you raise your hand if you think that bicycles are environmentally friendly? Okay, so that's pretty much everyone. Well, guess what? The EU will disagree with you. And that's because they refuse to include bicycles in the environmental goods agreement negotiations, because if they did so, they would have to remove tariffs on bicycles, and essentially the Italian bicycle industry would be wiped out by imports of cheaper and actually better bikes from China, right? So, and actually,
Says it all.
it says it all. And actually, this is one example. We could go with 1 hour on how environmental regulations historically are used as actually a form of protectionism, right? So that coordination is key within the government, right? And you see, for example, countries like Brazil, which have very high ambitions in terms of green industrial policy, but at the moment you have this very weird situation. We have 4 different ministries with 4 different green industrial policy strategies, with some overlaps, but also trade-offs. And this is where institutional learning by doing is really important, because the way that coordination happens really depends on each country. And in China, for example, they basically completely eliminated the Ministry of Energy at some point, because they realized that actually energy is a cross-ministerial issue, right? And so now it's an energy commission. I'm not saying that other developing countries should eliminate the Ministry of Energy, but the main lesson here is actually that process of institutional learning by doing, seeing what works, what doesn't, and adapting it to your local context, as opposed to, isomorphic mimicry and just importing solutions from somewhere else, and they don't necessarily work in your own context. But it's also in terms of the type of actor. Civil society historically has not been involved in industrial policy or growth discussions, but it has to be, because a lot of trade, or there's a different vested interest, right, in this type of green transformation plans, and it's key for it to be sustainable in the long term that a variety of actors are involved, especially in democracies where governments change so often, right? The second aspect is at the regional level. So something that is becoming even more obvious in the context of green transformation is the fact that, now we see a lot of the successful cases, they're really big countries, right? Including this one. There's a lot that you can do with demand side. you have the market scale. But what do you do if you're Togo, if you're Guatemala, if you're Suriname, right? You just don't have the same domestic market to make it happen. And this is where regional or multilateral coordination of industrialization is so important. In many regions in Africa, Latin America, you have where the critical minerals are, from where the proximity to trade route, from where you have the manufacturing capacity, to where we can actually produce renewables at lower cost. They're in different countries, right? So that work of coordinating industrial policies is so important. And actually, Andres Valenciano from ECLAC is doing a lot of that heavy lifting in Latin America. Now, on the international coordination, that's a whole different dimension. I think it was mentioned also earlier. Dr. Arvind had mentioned that there's the global common goods, right, that you need to be able to achieve that kind of growth. And frankly, this is just not happening, right? And you see the conversations at the global level, both in terms of trade and finance. And this is not essentially leveling the playing field, right, to enable industrial policy to take place. So yeah, these are some of the ways in which the climate and development agenda could be united, but it requires governments that take a lot more proactive role and try things and might fail in the process, but essentially need to do to be able to define where they want to sail in the green agenda.
So there's some disagreement across the panel on industrial policy and whether it works, or at least some nuance that all of you can shed on it. So it's a two-parter. One, straight up, do you think industrial policy works or not? And, if yes, why yes? If not, why not? And the second part is, most of the successful cases we know of industrial policy, and they're few and far between, they worked in a world when there was very little protectionism, especially in the international order. So they all had to pass a market test, right? So even if you're picking winners and losers in each country, either sectorally or firms or making deals with elites, they eventually, you knew if they succeeded or failed only when they passed, the global market contest. So in the current geopolitics, with as much protectionism as we have, and with the complete sort of collapse of the WTO, how will industrial policy work in this new world, if at all it worked in the old one, according to you? That's a simple one. In any order, feel free to go ahead. Or we can go in the same order.
I essentially believe that any policy that is well designed and well implemented will work. So this question of whether industrial policy works or not, it depends, on...
Don't we decide that something is well designed and well implemented ex post after it has worked?
Yes, so that's a challenge. Yes.
So yeah, I mean, I think the proof will be in the trying and learning by doing. And I think there's scope for regional trading communities to sort of provide the wider market test, right, that may be needed. So if you're say in Africa, you can think of ECOWAS in West Africa, which is a giant market, right? Nigeria, say, with what they're trying to do with petroleum, right? Aliko Dangote finally established a refinery so that Nigeria doesn't have to export crude and import refined oil. Part of the deal is that he'll supply the Nigerian market, but also sell to ECOWAS, right? So he will have to compete with Total in neighboring countries and other energy companies. So yeah, you can play a regional game, albeit with a limited market to start with. And then that can be a big enough pond to play in to prove your capacity to perhaps then step up to the global stage. And then, I think there's also scope for, I know right now when we think about protectionism, we often very much think about the north-south sort of trade barriers. Well, I think, there's still opportunity for south-south trade intensification. Which I think will speed up as developing countries grow more, right? India is massive, Brazil is massive, Africa is huge. No reason why if Europe and the US are putting up trade barriers, they shouldn't trade more with each other, in their own currencies even, as they're trying to these days.
So I'm going to say no, but again, with some caveats. Because if you look at the literature on industrial policy, and it's come back again on this, is that There are people who believe that there should be no selective policies for any specific firms or sectors, industries, and believe that completely selections by themselves can lead to bad outcomes. And there are those who believe selection actually is pretty important, because how would you essentially get the right kind of firms to invest and get innovation and so on. And so that debate carries on, and one can sort of take positions on this. And I don't really think there's any evidence either way, right? But I think the context is not so much industrial policy for the US, as we were discussing earlier this morning, right? And, or even high-capacity states like maybe even India or Brazil. We're talking about the low-income, low-capacity states, right? In those kind of contexts, with weak enforcement capacity of states, what exactly is industrial policy, right? If it is essentially enforcement of particular rules, and so you provide a subsidy to a firm and say, okay, guys, you've got to export, and I'm going to come after you if you don't, and I'm going to withdraw the subsidy. That needs enforcement capacity. Yeah. Where exactly do we see that in many of these low-income contexts? So if we do have industrial policy there, we know what will happen. We will know that there will be cronyism there, favors given to particular firms, particular groups, and effectively that industrial policy will essentially become a mechanism of rent sharing, right? So yes, industrial policy can work. If you are in the US, an IRA may be a good example of this, or maybe a medium to high capacity state. But in weak capacity states, industrial policy can essentially be a recipe for disaster. Now, what do you want to do in that context? What you want to do then in that context is to try to increase enforcement capacity of the state, try to invest in state capacity. There are a few pockets of effectiveness, some bureaucrats, right, who actually can make the calls and know that they make the calls is politically quite not palatable. Then, in other words, some firms may be, so you draw subsidies to some firms, they're fairly confident that that decision can be supported from the top, right? So what you want to do is create, so you cannot have generalized state capacity in this context, right? You've got to create pockets of effectiveness of some parts of the state which can enforce these sorts of policies. And then if you're confident that you can create these pockets of effectiveness in some parts of the bureaucracy who can enforce these policies, then yes, it can work. But then the problem there is creating these pockets of effectiveness and believing that the political elites will not try to interfere when bureaucrats make difficult decisions, right? So it's a big call, right? It's a big ask to expect that to happen in many of these country contexts. It doesn't mean that we should give up on industrial policy. I think that's what I'm saying is a caveat. If we build up the capacity in some localized way, in some parts of the state, yes, it can work. But that's exactly what we should focus on. How do you build up the capacity in those kind of contexts, rather than worrying about the policy itself?
I'll converge, but also diverge from what Kunal has said. I completely agree that industrial policy, in order to work, requires the appropriate types of governance mechanisms, right? But the question is, how do you build those mechanisms? Can you actually get there right away, or do you need to have some learning by doing, and actually mistakes as well on the way? For every country that has successfully implemented industrial policies, I'm sure that you can find many flops, right? Many industrial policies that didn't work, right? But the question is, how do you use that as an opportunity to improve your institutions and actually get there? Those of you who know me here know that I'm obsessed with sports analogies. That's why I was very happy with the Mike Tyson reference. But in many ways, this is like sports, right? If you want to excel at the field, you can't just go straight to the top 10. You need to fail on the way, right? And learn from those failures. Another analogy from the glorious sport of curling, which is that, you know, when you do curling, as one never does really, you kind of throw that little thing, but then you have those people that skate on the way to try to rectify the direction, right? And that's also similar to industrial policy. You won't get it right away, and actually that might be a problem, right? Because then you expect that you don't have to touch it. But if you know that things might go wrong, you have the right type of mechanisms to make sure that you can rectify, right, your industrial policies over time. So it becomes a very dynamic thing. And the very last thing is the alternative. Industrial policies are costly, and they're risky, and that needs to be accepted. Same like in venture capitalism, right? No one wants to get. But the thing is, what is the alternative of not doing it? And for countries that export mostly carbon-intensive goods, that are about to be hit by carbon border adjustment mechanisms from the EU, that don't have, that don't have the time to actually transition, essentially, if they don't do anything, right, they might hit the wall. So industrial policy is also a way to try to achieve structural transformation sooner. It's not saying that you won't get there with market forces, but it's saying that you need to fasten the process. Same with what the US has done with the IRA, right? They're late to the game, so they're bringing the big tools to try to catch up.
I think we open it up now. We have about 15 minutes. So Santosh, I think you need to wait for Mike, maybe. We have Ajay. We'll take one more, and then hopefully all of you can respond.
Santosh, after me. I have an opinion on this concept of getting going on a learning journey that we'll start something and then, over time, we'll learn it. In this, it's important to emphasize a whole array of things that are a feature of each country that are not specific to a field or a domain or a government agency. I like to use the phrase infrastructure. This is about transparency, rule of law, a free press, the kinds of data that is captured, and so on. And these tend to be features that are common across all sectors. So when the invisible infrastructure is broken, it's much harder to get going on any kind of iterative refinement. So it's better to be cautious.
Santosh, anyone else? We'll get that one in too.
Question to Amir and to Ken. That's about industrial policy, and I completely agree with Kunal that government capacity is central to the success of it. Let's just remind ourselves we're sitting in Washington. Washington consensus was very much against the notion of industrial policy. Recall John Page's work, The East Asian Miracle, 1993. I don't have to remind this audience, I'm sure. Amir and Ken, government capacity. Now, Amir, you brought up the issue of regional markets as opposed to small countries having too small a market. What's preventing the African Development Bank and the World Bank, which are very active in the region, to actually promote industrial policy in a group of states in the region? So you have actually enabling the possibility of industrial policy actually succeeding, because you're also ensuring markets. So that's the question to you. My question to Eliana, I've spent 15 years of my professional life working on and researching on skills, not just in India, but also in the Asian region. Eliana, what is it that prevents most of us from being able to convince governments from pulling back from their supply-driven approach to skill development and ensuring that they actually learn from Germany's example, and not just Germany's example. I mean, it's Austria, it's Switzerland, but it's also Brazil. I mean, Brazil has been a very good success story since 1942 with their levy-based system of financing the 5 S's. Now, I sense that you're Latin American. What do we need to ensure that this levy-based system, which is proven to be a very successful model of ensuring expanding financing from the private sector, because that's what ensures skin in the game from the private sector. Yeah. The governments actually don't want to give up control. Why can't we get, the bank spent $1 billion on skill development in India. I wish you were doing TA in India in this space.
No, I know
we'll give an arm and a leg for you to do that if that was to happen. Thank you very much.
And the gentleman at the back.
Thank you. James Foster from Gatsby Africa. I've got a question, I guess, about the choice of sectors, and maybe we'll come to that later in the conference, but I guess the green industrial policy element. At the moment, it feels like a lot of funders are running around looking for those amazing sectors that are both green and positive on the environment and so on. Whereas many countries, like Tanzania mentioned earlier, doesn't yet have a thriving plastics industry, but it needs one, and it could grow one, and it could be then really helpful in its food packaging industry. We're not going to help that because it's not quite aligned to our goals at the moment. Similarly, it has a bunch of coal next to an iron ore stream. It's obviously ripe for an iron and steel manufacturing plant. It's exporting some of its coal to Europe, but it's not. We're not, as Europeans or as funders, we're not supporting it to develop its iron and steel industry because it's not green. So I guess, where do we stand on that agenda, and how do we make the right choices or help countries make the right choices when we're pushing a sort of green industrialization agenda at the same time? Thank you.
Excellent. Ileana, do you want to start, and then we'll just take the questions in whichever order you guys would like to respond in.
Very good. I will start, but I also want to ask a question to the other panelists at the end. Not right now, in the next round. No, I just wanted to say, yes, I am aware of the conversations that are happening now with the government of India. Actually, there is an operation on skills that is being restructured. But just to address your question about the private sector and having more skin on the game, I believe that essentially one of the reasons why we haven't seen much change in this space is because the skills agenda so far has been driven by the education sector. Okay, and skills is not education. Skills is what happens between education and the execution of tasks. Is this knowledge that happens, when people translate education into, something that they can do in a productive space. So, and there is a shift inside the institution. We will see, how successful we will be at this. But now we are starting to talk about employability or skills for employability more generally, to try to emphasize the need to think about, skills in the context of the labor markets. So that on one side, this means that in practice, within the bank, we have started to see a bit more of cross-sectoral projects that are mixing, the education team and the social protection team, strengthening, the linkages and the relevance with the labor markets, either, by introducing sectoral boards, by also trying not only to put an emphasis on TVETs, but on private sector solutions, to the skills problems, etc. Now, I wanted to say that I think that it's a bit imprecise to say that the private sector doesn't have skin in the game. When I work with the private sector, and I have worked closely in my projects, they are the ones that are developing solutions. This is a problem that they are facing. They need to source qualified labor, and the education sector is not delivering that qualified labor. Oftentimes, they are the ones that are innovating in this space in terms of curriculums, training approaches, etc. And these curriculums then, are delivered at a larger scale eventually, and are absorbed as part of the mainstream TVET system. So I have also seen, particularly in countries that have weaker systems, like in Africa, where they are still developing, for example, the private sector is really, driving the development of the labor market and skilling systems and having an active role.
The state needs to withdraw for that to grow.
Exactly. So now, it's also that it's, as you said, it's more like this conversation about what is the appropriate role for the public sector versus the private sector, right? And how these two, the TVET system that is, public, and these other, emerging, models of training that are usually more responsive also to the changing labor market, can really, work together, right? And to what extent the government should simply, provide resources to co-fund or co-finance the delivery of these training programs. Now, I do believe that there is a role for the government to deliver some skills to the extent that they may be, foundational, transferable skills across sectors. But one of the challenges that we face in this space is that when firms say they don't find the skills that they need, they are not thinking about the industry-relevant or sector-relevant skills. Oftentimes, they are talking about firm-specific skills, right? For example, I can tell you in Mexico, Audi and BMW need two different sets of skills for their workers in the plants even if they are in the same automotive sector, because they have different type of equipment, et cetera. So just to signal, what is the extent of the specificity. So I do think that there is a role for the public sector to fund some of the more foundational, transferable, and then there is a gap that will have to be covered by the employers themselves. The other thing is I believe that there is a role for the government also to produce more of these skills than what would be optimal from the private sector perspective to produce. The private sector is only, producing these skills to the level that it meets the need that they have, like to fill some vacancies. And oftentimes also the way in which they target their programs is different from what a national program would do. Normally, they first select the participants, the trainees, and then they deliver the skills, right? As opposed to, delivering skills to a larger segment of the population and then doing the recruitment, after the...
Santosh, I think you'll have to chat with Ileana after. We have 6 minutes, and I want to make sure I give a chance to the rest of you to just respond quickly to all the questions that came to you.
Yes, so I'll start with a question of energy, something that I've also thought about in the context of Africa. I think there's a tension, as you highlighted, right? There's quite a bit of hypocrisy at the global level, which unfortunately we tend to ignore in the field of development, right? So we know that the North is not going to stick by their energy commitments. And yet we design policies and strongly encourage policymakers in low-income countries to act as if these global compacts actually make sense, right? I think we should be very honest about this fact, right? And allow low-income countries to pursue independent energy policies given the environment that they're actually working with, right? As opposed to imagining that we can constrain them, pretending that these global compacts are making sense or the people will follow through on them, while confining them to energy poverty, and therefore making it much harder for them to industrialize or even have functional service sectors. Right? Electricity is needed for a whole range of services that are not working as efficiently as they could in low-income countries because of brownouts and power cuts and all that. So that's something that we should be very honest about, right? Energy is core to growth, and we can't have growth when low-income countries are confined to energy poverty. So more gas, if it's available, I guess, would be the mantra. And so on the World Bank and industrial policy, I guess at the regional level in African countries, I think part of the challenge is personnel-based. And, there are lots of other challenges, but I think, who's the typical person at the bank who's helping a typical African country, right? It's not a person who's trained to think in these terms, right? And especially when you try to say that, we can't have a clear-cut designed intervention that we can evaluate. We're asking you to take a leap of faith and learn by doing, right? The career incentives are just not there. The technical training is just not there. Quite frankly, the political economy analysis that would be needed to help countries sort of execute on some of these projects, at the national level, not to mention the regional level, are just not there, right? So if I could do one thing, I would focus on just personnel, right? Getting enough people in the room who have an alternative perspective on how to achieve these outcomes. And then hope that they can have seats at the table to help design some of these policy interventions.
Amir, do you want to follow up on that, and then we'll give Kunal the last word?
Yeah, sounds good. I was hoping that you would address the tough questions on coordination, but first I think you discussed the sector selection criteria. Something that needs to be really clarified is that what is green in one country might not be green in another, no? And the definition of green is actually very contentious because, let's say, the global north suffers perhaps from the kind of carbon tunnel vision or the carbon obsession. So all the green agenda is really about emissions. But in many countries, African countries, the biggest ecological challenge that they face is not emissions, but actually material waste, material pollution, plastic pollution. biodiversity loss, overuse of renewable resources like water or fishery. So there is a big question there in terms of how do you own the green agenda based on your local realities and what you need to do, and clarify whether you're pursuing green industrialization for someone else's demand or if you're doing it for your own ecological needs, right? And that sector selection issue needs to be really driven by governments so that they are also accountable to citizens as to why they've picked one sector over another, and it's not externally imposed, which is something that really tends to happen, right? On the coordination issue, that's a very good question as to why are they already coordinating, but there might be the sense of necessity, right? And actually, one of the great examples of multilateral coordination for an industry is Airbus, where France, Germany, UK and Spain got together because they saw the threat from Boeing dominating the skies, and that created that urgency for them to pull together resources for R&D, different supply chains to actually build Airbus. Now on the African continent, you're absolutely right. There is so much more that can be done at the regional and sub-regional level, but it requires different types of capabilities to actually negotiate, right, this at the multilateral level. And then governments and the private sector versus state. To finish with another sports analogy, governments should behave more like the head coach, like the Zinedine Zidane of the economy, that they don't have to be on the pitch to make a difference. They don't have to be just the referee that sets the rules, but even to being on the sidelines, they can set the vision, the strategy, the training that enables the teams, aka the firms, to be a lot more competitive with one another.
The day we have a government like Zidane, I think we can wrap up shop. We don't need to have this conversation. Kunal?
Yeah, just very quickly, I want to come back to this point about skills and so on. I don't think you're saying this, Ileana, but where I might disagree is that ultimately, if you look at what's going on, right, the circular transformation process, a whole bunch of workers still in agriculture, South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, when they move, if you heard this morning, they're moving to non-tradable, very low productivity services, and in India, construction, right? Mm-hmm. So they're not moving to manufacture, they're not moving to tradable services. Then the question then is that, okay, you're skilling these workers, right? Where exactly are they going to end up if there isn't enough demand created for the better jobs, whether it's formal or even upper, better quality informal? So the problem really still is, where is the demand for this, right? And I think at the end of the day, that's why one has to be careful, because one pushes too much the skilling agenda, one forgets, well, the government needs to think about job creation, good job creation, right? And I think that the bank is not thinking about these issues, but that's where the real challenge is right now, right? And I think that's something we haven't got very good solutions right now for these two big areas of where most of the poor people live, Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. Right? So I think that's what we need to be careful, that particular agenda doesn't get missing.
Balance. No, absolutely, and I think that's what I meant to refer to when I mentioned that one of the problems that we have is that this agenda has been driven exclusively by the education sector. Yeah. And we need to think about this in a more comprehensive way. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I could do this for another hour, but I think we have a session right after this. No break. Thank you for being here. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you.
I encourage everybody to take a seventh inning stretch if you need to, but don't leave the street or the seat. The hot dog stand's not open, so take a stretch and we'll set up for the next one. Gentlemen. So it's time now for our fireside chat. We don't have a fire, but we'll have a good chat. We have two well-known persons. According to his biography, Lant Pritchett has retired 3 times, but is still very active, and I think hangs at least one of his hats at LSE. And Manish Sabharwal is the vice chair of Team Lee Services. And a coin was flipped in the back room, and Lant won the toss, so he gets to start the chat. I leave it to you two gentlemen.
Okay. So I'm super happy to be here, super happy to be on a panel with an actual private sector entrepreneur who's been successful outside of the development discourse and actually been successful in creating a firm that employs more people than the city I grew up in. I want to just talk about 2 things. One is why I am been focused on recentering growth and what I think that might take. And the second is to sort of think of some of the arguments against recentering growth, in particular from a funding emphasis point of view. So I wrote in 2002, I wrote a paper called What's the Big Idea? That was about the debate over the ways in which one could successfully promote growth, sort of the market, the big push industrial policy of the 60s and 70s versus the counter, structural adjustment, Washington Consensus, and we were discussing what's the 3rd generation of growth policies. Little did I know that all of this would become moot because people would lose the idea that there needed to be a big idea about how to promote growth, and that what Arvind called the nano development would become, in some sense, a principal agenda, not of countries. And again, I think Arvind was very correct. I was asked at a panel last week to talk about the future of development, and I said, let's distinguish between the future of development that the developing countries are going to do, the future of a development industry of people who self-consciously are doing development, and the future of development research, what academia is doing. And frankly, if the development industry and the development research don't refocus on growth, they become irrelevant to the future of development. They don't alter the future of development, they just become irrelevant to the future of development. So I was at a speech given by the head of the UNDP, which is one of the largest funders of development, or at least was at the time. This was probably almost, and he just blithely said, we have learned from experience that economic growth doesn't deliver on the goals we have for development. And I was like, that's either stunning ignorance or a stunning lie or both. Like, just nothing could be further from the empirically documented realities about the relationship between levels of well-being in nearly every dimension and economic growth. And then our friends at JPAL issued, like a blog written by the executive director of JPAL saying, well, growth can help, but growth is not enough to produce poverty reduction. And I thought, again, that's just so blatantly, obviously false in the data that how would a person of even moderate information and responsibility say such a crazy thing? And so I realized that the global development discourse, and again, not at the country level. I mean, nobody in India was saying, economic growth, who cares? It was like, can we get to 6? Can we get to 7? So I basically wrote a series of things that make the case that not just that growth is one important factor in achieving human well-being, but it's far and away the dominant factor, and that for certain things like poverty reduction, it's what I call not logically necessary and sufficient, but it's empirically necessary and sufficient. No country has actually reduced poverty from high levels to low levels without the median person in the country also getting enormously better off. There's no successful programmatic approach to, again, there are cost-effective, potentially, interventions that cost-effectively address poverty, but they can't push you from 80% poverty to 20% poverty. There's just no, it's outside the realm of all experiences of all time that ever happens, and yet, people are claiming, and conversely, no country, it's just false that economic growth isn't enough. No country has gotten rich and yet continued to have high levels of poverty. It's just, so I think that's the synthesis paper, and Arvind was already reluctant to bang the drum about it, because hopefully everybody knows it. But I just want to reinforce that nearly every objective that any of us have from a normative point of view of how human well-being will improve is going to be massively facilitated by a more productive economy. And it's maybe even stronger than that. It's just not going to be achieved in any other way. So I think that's, the big question is, again, how do people who have the sense enough to get dressed in the morning deny this? And that, I think, is a complex political economy inside the development industry. That the development industry became less interested in being engaged in promoting economic growth, and hence they convinced themselves that it wasn't really that important. So I think the causation ran backwards. They changed their mind about what they wanted to do, and so they changed the facts or attempted to change the claimed facts about what was really important. And I think part of the effort of recentering growth has to be recentering ourselves on the facts about where people, what kinds of standard of living people are actually living at, what can be accomplished both with private and the public sector with economy of a given productivity, and the realization that, whatever the other challenges are, this is, if you want to be in partnership with development of the countries, you need to assist them in making their economy more productive, because that's what they want to do. And whatever other arguments might, anyway. I think the paper's out there, it's in the printed material. I think it's compelling to anyone who's willing to just look at the data, because the analysis is not that sophisticated. It's like, here are all of the, here's the observations of every country's poverty and their level of median consumption, and here's the scatter plot. It isn't like, this is about facts. This isn't even about causal analysis. It's just the facts. Okay. Second, and then I'm super anxious to get to Manish, and then to questions. The second thing is, I think the main obstacle to greater funding and greater action on the growth front is some amount of recalcitrance on the acknowledgement of the importance of growth, but some amount of what specifically would we do, right? And I think the experience of structural adjustment gave people the impression that economists only had one view about how to promote growth, and that was the dominant, completely overweening orthodoxy, and secondly, that it was wrong. And therefore, even if we wanted to promote growth, we just don't know how. And there, I think this is the second reason, I think, and the important reason for this meeting and a growth summit is, we are much further along in understanding the processes of creating economic growth and the analysis of economic growth than we were in 1982. 1982 was when Mexico defaulted on the debt, and structural adjustment of necessity came into the world. Of necessity of the American banks not getting defaulted on. That was the necessity that drove structural adjustment. So, you know, it's not as if we can say, well, we don't know how to do growth, because I would make two cases. One, we have learned a lot about just the empirical nature of growth, about it being episodic, about what the correlates of episodes of growth are, of the specificity of growth prioritization, meaning that while the Washington Consensus may have said some things that were generally true, it wasn't ever intended to be, nor was it an accurate representation of everything one could do to promote growth. So, but I think we've made a ton of progress on that. Second, I'm going to have a second and a third. Second, I think this argument is just weird. Because if I came to you and said, there's this really devastating disease called polio, and it, you know, has these devastating lifelong consequences for children, but we don't have any way of preventing it, no one's conclusion is, oh, polio is not so important then. Like, no, no, let's work on a vaccine. If we have an important objective that we'd love to achieve and we don't know how to do it, like what could be a higher priority domain for doing future research, unless you somehow believed that it was just an impossible question. Like if someone came and proposed research in physics on, you know, faster than light travel, you might say, well, geez, that's just incompatible with our known science, and so we're not doing research about what's impossible. But it's clearly not impossible to generate episodes of growth. I mean, you know, it's almost ironic that Robert Lucas wrote a paper about economic growth saying, man, it would just be so important if there were anything the Indian government could do to accelerate India's growth in 1988. It's like, turns out, Bob, there is. Turns out this, you know, the Hindu rate of growth wasn't inevitable, it was an actionable thing. Yeah, so I think growth is super important, demonstrably important, has never moved off the agenda of the developing countries and their governments and or their people, but has moved off the agenda of the development industry and development academia for exogenous reasons about the internal dynamics of the discipline of economics in one sense and geopolitical changes in another. I think both of those, within that, it's possible to recenter on growth. I think the argument against focusing on growth, I'm now remembering the third thing, that we don't know how to do it. Well, if you don't know how to do it, like, that's what research is about. Like, we don't say, oh, dang, I wish we had a vaccine for this disease, but we don't, so we're going to pretend it isn't important. We do research about it. And the third thing is I think this alternative agenda that acts as if promoting economic growth is hard, but doing other things that would improve well-being in those same contexts is easy. You might say, well, in this country, it'd be really hard to create a political coalition to promote economic growth, but we can do all these wonderful things to reduce inequality. Well, maybe, but that would be an odd political economy in some sense, that this is politically impossible, but this other thing that might just be just as politically objectionable and equally unattractive to the elites is possible. So oftentimes the debate is framed as if growth is hard, but programmatic interventions are easy. Again, maybe, but lots more countries have actually managed to promote rapid economic growth than have managed to create education systems that really educate children well. So some things we think of as logistically easy turn out to be harder. So I think, as might be obvious, I'm like gung-ho for getting growth back central within the development agenda, and I think the arguments against doing so are just, you know, yeah. Okay. The arguments that it's just not important just strike me as surreal, and I think demonstrably so. And the arguments that it's important but we don't know how, I'm sympathetic to. That, you know, it is a super complex, sophisticated, how do you work with country governments to which us outsiders are going to be marginally relevant to create conditions in which the kind of triple effective, doable, and politically supportable emerge? That's a super hard question, which is why we need 1,000 times more people than are in this room today working on them. So let me turn to Manish, who has been, I don't need to prompt him, he's been prompted for kind of opening questions or what he wants to say, and plus he can say whatever he wants, but I think it's just wonderful to have an actual, everybody talks about the private sector, but no one actually listens to them. So Manish is a successful entrepreneur in India, and I'd love to hear what he has to say.
Yeah. No, I mean, I'll explain why I'm not an admission error or a trespasser in the conference. I've hired somebody every 5 minutes for the last 25 years, but only hired 5% of the kids who came to me for a job. So about 10 years ago, I'm an entrepreneur. I started the company straight out of business school. And 10 years ago, I realized that the only thing that stood between me and 1 million employees was really public policy. I have 400,000 employees on it right now, but I probably should have 4 or 5 times that number. But it wasn't inside the company. I could do better IT systems, I could do better sales, I could do better marketing, but that would get me to 30, 40, 50% more. But my ambition was to be 5 times more or 10 times more, and that binding constraint was external to the company. And for us, the questions on the earlier panel, the thinking versus doing question, and Kunal's sort of worm's eye view versus bird's eye view, which matters more, we deal with it on a daily basis, right? And I don't think that, and I think the problem is we don't meet enough as thinkers and doers, right? My father wore a uniform and he worked in national security, but a plaque behind him, which he always used to carry with him all his life, was that any army that has too much of a gap between its thinkers and doers will have its fighting done by fools and its thinking done by cowards. So I think that it's really important to think about that, because sometimes this thinking and doing world gets so parallel. You do your own thing, you look down upon us as we get no big picture, and we look down upon you as you get nothing done. And I think that is really important to sort of not recognize that that's the stupidest view of the world. I mean, if you only do things, you'll do nothing great. If you only think, you'll do nothing. And from my perspective, that's why I sort of started spending so much time on public policy, on labor markets, and obviously I went to Lance class many years ago, and it was just clear to me, and especially in the last 5 years where I've spent it on the central bank board, that we have oversold fiscal and monetary policy. Either we've mislabeled it or oversold, whatever. I haven't, after 5 years on the central bank board, I haven't decided whether monetary policy is a placebo or a painkiller or a steroid. It's clearly not a medicine. And it's really important to start, recognizing that it's a very important part of policy, but it doesn't do as much as we think it does. And obviously, if fiscal deficits could make countries rich, then why would any country bother being poor, right? So I think that overselling fiscal and monetary policy has really become a challenge when you take the worm's eye view of daily life of employers, right? I think whether it's firm productivity, whether it is demand-driven skills, two of the important issues which I spend most of my time on. And in India, we have to explain it, right? I was raising this question with Lance, that I don't think 30 years ago you would have predicted that a democracy like India would have delivered, China has delivered minus 13% shareholder returns in the last 30 years. India has delivered 1,300%. So we have delivered 13x. If you put your money in India 30 years ago, you made 13 times your money, while in China you lost 13% of your money. But they moved 450 million people from farms, and we still have 42% of our labor force working in farms. You wouldn't predict a democracy would not deliver wage growth and would deliver shareholder growth, while an autocracy would deliver wage growth and wouldn't deliver shareholder growth, right? And I have spent a lot of time in my limited perspective, and I don't speak for other countries or other stuff like that, is that, infrastructure, why isn't India generating the good jobs? why is employed poverty? India doesn't have an unemployment problem. Everybody has a job, but we have 35% of our people are employed poverty. Or, they've got a job, but they don't make enough money to. And that goes back to productivity of 5 things, right? Which state you live in, which city you live in, which firm you work for, which sector you work in, and what skills you have, right? It's obvious. The state, Karnataka, where I live in Bangalore, we have the same GDP as UP, but we do it with 1/5 the number of people. Right? If you think about sectors, agriculture is 42% of the labor force. It only has 14% of GDP, while we're all proud of IT, but it's a rounding error. And software is 0.8% of India's labor force, but it's 9% of GDP, right? So which sector you work in, which firm you work in, there's a 24 times difference. I mean, that all of you know how much difference there is in productivity between our large firms and small firms, between our formal firms and our informal firms, and obviously which skill you have. I pay 4 times different salary to a kid the same age, technically the same qualification on paper, but I will pay 4 times difference in salary. And I have at least isolated in my mind the growth constraint for the private sector, right? It's not in, infrastructure and skills and finance have shifted from being a dagger in the heart to a thorn in the flesh. I think we will get better at it, but now you can set up, you can make 25% of the world's iPhones in India, and we will be this year. We have 40 China factory refugees. Maybe 20 of them will jump. I hope Xi Jinping doesn't get a 4th term. I hope he gets a life term because he's our biggest ally in that. So I think if you talk to these factory refugees, it's not infrastructure, it's not skills for the next 20 million. Yes, for the next 200 million, we have to do stuff. But for 25 million, I mean, we staffed up Apple. Foxconn is one of our largest customers. We gave them 40,000 people in 6 months. And so that was easily possible and doable in a country like India. And we could probably do another 500,000. So I think, at least from my vantage point, if you think about for India, the only remaining one is really regulatory cholesterol, what I call it. It's a difficult place to do business. And I talked about this regulatory cholesterol for a long time from a bird's eye view, right? But I only got traction in this when we moved to the worm's eye view. So 3 years ago, we put together the database of 67,000 compliances, 6,700 filings, and 26,000 ways to go to jail for an employer. You may say, well, how does anybody do business? Well, the transmission losses between how the law is written, interpreted, practiced, and enforced. Obviously, the government got very upset that there's not a single CEO in jail. So how do these 26,000 laws matter? I mean, there's not a single CEO in jail. So why are you making such a big deal? Why are you giving us a bad name? You're supposed to be an ally. You put out a report. And one of my favorite Hindu scriptures is the Vishnu Sahasranam, which roughly translates to, so I told him, that it roughly translates to, why did God create fear? So he could take it away. The only reason we have these 26,000 is they are not using them for what they should be. Have 20 of them, have 100 of them. A lot of private sector people should be in jail, but they should be in jail for very specific things, which they deserve to be in jail for, not random stuff, because if you have 26,000 ways, then nobody will be in jail, right? So I think from my vantage, it's really this kind of, sometimes these conversations. In my mind, why is India poor? Because we don't have enough teamwork between the government, private sector, and nonprofits, right? The government has an execution deficit, the private sector has a trust deficit, and nonprofits have a scale deficit. So at least the growth agenda will only truly come together when these 3 instincts, people in government have very different instincts than people in the private sector. It's not better, it's just different, and it's needed. Me in the private sector has a very different instinct than importing a levy for skill development. We will manufacture our employees because it's in our self-interest, and we have started figuring out how to do that. If you let us do that, right? If degree apprenticeships, India only has 500,000 apprentices. Why? Because of regulatory cholesterol, and stupid Apprenticeship Act was written in 1961, where Germany has 2.7% of its labor force. Why don't we have 15 million apprenticeships? Well, either we should have 15 million apprenticeships or 5,000 CEOs in jail, because in India, if you don't have an apprentice, the CEO can go to jail. So you have neither because you have done it. And I would say that at least if you let us figure out our people's supply chains, if you think of IT, right, we had 400,000 engineers in 2004. In a boom, we went up to 1.8 million engineers in 2013. Then we had a slowdown. 400,000 engineering seats went off between 2013 and 2020, and now we're back up to 1.5 million, because the most real-time people supply chain in India is in software. I mean, we have the switching costs in software that China has in manufacturing. We did export more software than Saudi Arabia did oil in 2021, not now, but at that point. So I think the people supply chains, I mean, I was listening to Ilana and I just saw her paper and she's saying these things don't work. Maybe they don't work because there was an execution deficit in the matching program. We think we know how to manage. We can prove that there's a return on investment for employers. In fact, we've built our business on that, with faster time to hire, higher productivity, and lower attrition. I can prove to a CFO that your hurdle rate for hiring people is 12%, and in our degree apprenticeship program, we'll give you a better return than that. So this is not CSR, this is not TEI, this is not charity, this is just a more efficient people supply chain. So I think growth from an India perspective, we're doing really well on the economic growth. I think we will continue to do that. I mean, we will never be China. I think we're never going to get to 10 or something like that, but 6%, 7%, 8% compounding for 20 years. And we will be consistently warm. We won't be hot or cold. And maybe that's not that horrible, or maybe that's actually a feature. It's not a bug. If we're at 6, don't worry, we're going to 8. If we're at 8, don't worry, we're going to 6. Is sort of the way we think. And so from our perspective, this growth agenda is really important. But if you want to deconstruct on why we still have 42% of people left on farms, even though we're generating sort of GDP growth, even though we have generated 13 times returns for shareholders, but why do we still have 250 million people on farms? I know 1991 was very important, and she has a project called the 1991 Project, but 35 years later, we should not have 40. So if it was that great, then why do we still have 250 million people? So I think the growth agenda is really important. I'm a big fan of what Lance says in his paper. And from India's perspective, just that top-line growth has to translate into sort of the large firms, the good jobs, because that's finally the point. And I think from the private sector in India, we are starting to catch our belief that we don't really need them to fix the people supply chain. We do need them to do primary education. That we can't do. But the repair, prepare, and upgrade that all of us thought we were expecting from the government, we can do ourselves. But I'll pause here.
Okay. We're at the time when we were supposed to finish, but everybody else is encroached. So why don't we take some questions? We'll take, given tradition, 3 questions, and we said very different things. So,
go ahead, sir.
Okay, yeah. So why don't we take one? Let's take one from over there, guy in the back, and then Nancy, because we're at Nancy's house, the Birdsall house. So 1,
Great.
2, 3.
I'm Bradley Cunningham.
Hey, it's Brad.
Hey, good to see you, Lance.
My vision's getting bad. If you stood up, I would have recognized you.
Ironically, as you were speaking, I got an email message about the Be Ready indicators. So I wanted to ask about that. The Be Ready indicators being
Okay.
the new version of the Doing Business indicators.
Oh, okay. Uh-huh.
And I ask in part because they're supposed to be better. So it's supposed to be an improvement
Yeah.
of looking at de facto and de jure, which, Lance, you know about, you've thought about a lot, taking out the rankings so that countries aren't setting their growth agenda around externally set indicators. But at the same time, it still strikes me as the wrong way for countries to set their growth policy. You know, they're doing the Be Ready indicators are interviewing firms to get their information, but wouldn't it be better if these countries were, as you said, interviewing these firms themselves and getting their information about the business environment by having a dialogue with the firms? And it strikes me, you know, the work that I supported Matt Andrews doing in Albania, when he just went out and had the Ministry of Economy talk to all of the 200 garment firms themselves rather than relying on an intermediating entity to do that conversation for them. So I'm curious what you think about the role of something like a revamped Doing Business Indicators, whether it's Be Ready or whatnot. And if I could indulge in a second question, maybe it's too parochial, but I really think there's an important role for large firms in this, but development has sort of fetishized SMEs, MSMEs. And in my job, it would be really difficult for me to, the conversation about taking a firm from 100 employees to 500 employees. Well, I can't do that because that's a large enterprise, right? And it's just accepted as legitimate to work with MSMEs and not work with large enterprises. So I guess maybe the question embedded in that is there a role for the small entrepreneur? I mean, surely there is, but surely that's not the only thing that we should be doing if our agenda is growth.
Okay.
Thanks.
This guy with the...
Thanks, Karthik from UC Berkeley and GiveWell. I have a question about self-employment, because I think that a large part of the lack of unemployment numbers is that a lot of people are self-employed, 50 to 70 to 80%. And if you include even half of those people as maybe preferring formal sector employment and they would really like a job, but they can't find one, the unemployment numbers start to look much, much larger than they might be in the official numbers, where it only counts people who can't find literally any job. And when you think about those people, like, what is the main barrier to those people finding jobs in any of the enterprises that you might try to train them for, or to get those apprenticeships, both in India and elsewhere?
Great. Nancy.
I didn't have a chance to ask at the last session, which is, but it's relevant, I think. There was some brief discussion of the East Asian miracle, where one of the unusual factors associated with that miracle is that governments worked very closely with the private sector. So I'm just curious from either of you about whether that's something that might work in India. Do you think it's a good idea, a bad idea? The second question has to do with some of what Manish, thank you, said about the thousands of employees. My colleague Justin Sandifer, who's not here because he's probably in China right now, did a study which showed that in India, probably it was North India, not South India, most people interviewed who had finished primary school could not read a sentence. So, maybe this is a question for Lant as well.
Maybe.
This sort of false distinction between working on education and health versus working on growth that has sort of been vaguely there in some of the discussions today. I'm not blaming either of you at all. I'm just interested in any comment on where can India go in terms of a highly productive service-based economy in a country where most people who finish primary school can't read a sentence, without more attention to the human capital. And anything you can say about whom you hire and what they know and what levels of skills, and is it hard to get highly skilled people, and and anything Land can say about this issue of, well, you know, premature deindustrialization, so does India have to go into services, and how can India go into services, which are really based on so much face-to-face and use of letters and words to interact. Thank you both. Thank you both very much. Great discussion already.
You go, Land.
So let me, I'm going to leave self-employment and SMEs to you, because I think it's kind of an interesting. And the Be Ready, I can't say anything about it because I just haven't. I didn't even, you know, I think the doing business indicators had a big problem in that they only represented the de jure, right? And I have done a lot of research to show that, you know, what Ken was talking about and what Kunal was talking about of deals emerges when you have laws that you don't routinely enforce. So again, if you have a law, if you have 6,000 laws that you could go to jail for labor violations, but nobody's in jail, it really means everybody, it's given the government complete discretion, because they could put anybody in jail that they felt like, right? So, so I think the doing business indicators were worse than useless. I think, given that I don't know anything about the Be Ready, I do want to say growth diagnostics was a prioritization exercise that colleagues at the Kennedy School and others helped, you know, and I was a part of the team that kind of put it together. And I think that to the extent anything is a valuable contribution to a growth diagnostics exercise, it's helpful. To the extent it isn't, it isn't. Because the difficulty is, and sometimes when I would teach classes, I would start with a group this size and say, let's, you know, say what's good for growth. And I'll just write what you guys think is good for growth on the chalkboard. And somewhere about 25 things, separate things that were good for growth, it started to dawn on some people in the class that I was tricking them. That, holy smoly, we've just listed 25 things that are good for growth. Which of those things, you know, a typical developing government can do 3. Like if you're president of Tanzania and you have an agenda, it's going to have 3 items to be ambitious. So how would you prioritize from the 25 things that are good for growth, in the sense that if you did it in the long run, you would be better than if you didn't, versus what would be really super terrifically good for growth as today in this context, right? So I think to the extent that this Be Ready can be an integral input into a growth diagnostic, it might be helpful. And it might be helpful even if governments could have done it. But I think you're also right that governments, unless they actively engage with potentially outsiders who can bring capacity and structure to it, in growth diagnostics, nothing's really going to help them that much, because all of these long list exercises, I mean, you know, a long list exercise is going to ultimately ends up in a prioritization exercise. And the less transparent the prioritization is, the more likely the prioritization is wrong. Because if you give a government a list of 25 things they should do or would be good for growth, then they're either going to optimize on what's easiest or on what's politically most popular, independently of what's effective, right? So again, growth diagnostics, growth diagnostics, growth diagnostics. East Asia Miracle, I think, you know, there needs to be close interaction between private firms and governments. The best description of what happened in East Asia was Peter Evans, the sociologist's description of embedded autonomy, that the Korean institutions had autonomy to act as the government, but they were embedded, and they were embedded with private firms, right? And so, you know, can industrial policy work? Well, it seemed to work in some ways in India. In Korea, it's very hard to argue, you know, in the East Asia Miracle report that the bank wrote, there was a big debate about industrial policy. And I remember, you know, people were saying, well, Korea did really well, but they would have, you know, industrial policy wasn't really a part of it. And Larry Summers would said, that's really implausible, you guys. And they, well, what do you mean? It's like, well, if you're telling me that South Korea grew faster than any other country in history, but they would have grown even faster had they not had industrial policy, that's just stupid. Like, that's really implausible that Usain Bolt is the fastest person on the planet, but boy, he would have been faster had he not run in the particular way he ran. It doesn't make any sense. So anyway, the real problem, though, is that, you know, Korea may have had an embedded autonomy, but most countries have embed with the money, which sounds superficially, you know, close cooperation with the private sector can either take the form of just providing massive favors to politically favored firms that exclude actively anyone else, so you can get a growth boom, and this is what Kunal was describing as the, you know, you can create a growth boom by getting in bed with a small amount of investors and creating a lot reliable, you know, high profitability, high credibility environment for just them, but that tends to peter out. So I think a deep question about growth is, you know, how do you get embedded autonomy and not just in bed with the money? And that's a hard thing about the efficacy with which a government can actively and autonomously promote productivity in various sectors. So I am like on this read and growth debate, I'm on all sides of it, right? Which, you know, what is it? There's a phrase, consistency is the hobgoblin of small minds. So I'm a very large-minded guy on this issue. I have written various things that say potentially very, so I think it's terrible, immoral, awful to put kids through school and not teach them to read. Like, it's just cruel. Like, you know, to make a kid spend 5 years or 6 years or 8 years of their life inside a building called school and not provide them the environment with which they can acquire this very beautiful thing. That's terrible. I spent 8 years of my life on a big research project on how to make, you know, how to help schools be more effective at conveying real foundational skills. That said, I'm not that convinced that it's that often the binding constraint to growth. I think if, you know, you can often take even rudimentarily prepared labor and make it vastly more productive by engaging it in a highly productive value chain. So I am reasonably confident that if you let someone from India with 5 years of schooling and couldn't read move to the Gulf, their wages would go up 4 times. If you let them move to the US, even as an illiterate person, their wages would go up 10 times, because I think Manish just listed all the ways that determine your income, and skills is one of them, but a lot of it is the place you're in and everything else. So I am all in favor of kids who go to school learning to read. Spent a lot of my life working on that. I don't happen to believe it's very often a binding constraint to growth, in part because a lot of it, if firms really want workers who can do it, they can remediate this at relatively low cost. So I forget that you had some nice phrase of repair.
And upgrade.
An upgrade. I think once firms, you know, if firms were really beating down the door for workers, they could, I think, mitigate the consequences relatively easily. So, Manish.
Okay. So the MSME question is, I'm not sure I've made up my mind whether, you know, small firms are sort of should be whacked and shut down or something like that. I would only say that the regulatory cholesterol affects them more than us. See, I have 120 guys in regulatory affairs whose only job is handling the regulatory cholesterol. And for me, I don't care about it anymore in some sense, right? Because, so if you really care about the romance of small and you care about the small guys, I think the first thing you would do is recognize that I can provide my own transport, I can manufacture my own employees, I can generate my own electricity, which I do, all these three things, but small people won't be able to. So we can substitute for the state, but small people won't here. So if MSME is a priority, then the regulatory cholesterol matters more to them than to us. I think the self-employment question is 50. It's the most embarrassing number about India, that 50% are self-employed. It's not some overweighted entrepreneurial gene among Indians. The poor cannot afford to be unemployed, so they are self-employed. But I believe, I'm not an economist, but I believe there was this idiot Russian economist called Chayanov. He convinced Nehru in the 1920s that small farms are viable because you don't have to pay your kids a salary, your wife a salary, yourself a salary, and you don't have to pay rent. And he called it the theory of self-exploitation. And he wrote a book on it. These are not, 50% are not self-employed, they're self-exploiting. And what has changed in India is that kids are no longer willing to self-exploit. Their aspirations have gone up. They've said, we're not willing to do this anymore. So the two shock absorbers in India's labor market, which were farming and a sort of informal service or kirana employment, suddenly kids are saying, yes, I mean, it may be a job, as you said, but it's employed poverty. And so the stock and flow of India's job market hasn't changed, but there is a lot of chaos about jobs because kids are saying, I won't do it. So I think the self-employment has to come down, of course, and that's why I would prefer us talking about wages rather than jobs, because that's what matters more than anything else. As far as school surveys, of course, I mean, there's some silver lining. The Asser report, which is the one which has been doing this for 20 years. This is the first time that there's good news. I mean, I used to,
really?
Yeah, there's more kids in school, more learning. 98% have digital access, more learning outcomes. For the first time, I used to boycott their launches because it was depressing, but this time I went because it was some good news, not great news. But I'm sort of, with Lant in some sense. We were dancing with this ghost to school and college. Foxconn trains its workers for 8 weeks. A fresher. It's 8 weeks of training in the classroom, and then it's 8 weeks on then. And then because they have embedded everything into the machines, into the processes, so it's not very high-skilled people that are making your iPhones, in some sense. I used to think that that would be a problem, but when they showed up and when Samsung showed up, it's 8 weeks. They do need to have numeracy, literacy, and that kind of stuff. But we will be able to find the first 25 million workers if suddenly India, had this factory rush. The first 25 million may not be a problem. The next 100 million, 200 million, we obviously have to, get our act together, which we are sort of trying to do. For us personally, 50% of our kids are graduates, 50% are not graduates. We pay the same salary to both of them. 50% of our 400,000 employees. You asked what is our pool. No, a bachelor's degree. 50% of our kids have a bachelor's degree, 50% don't. We pay the same salary to both of them. 40% of them are women. They're in 5,000 cities and towns. About 250,000 come to us every month. I only hire 25,000. I would, if the super cycle went off. But I would say, again, skills for the companies are a thorn in the flesh. They'll keep shouting at me, I need them to be more productive. But attrition is 50% for everybody, including, for many people it's more, because they're getting better jobs quickly. So they wouldn't be leaving.
Once they're trained.
Yeah, once they're trained, it's an apprenticeship program in storage. So I would say that there's sort of good news on that front in some sense. On the human capital front, there has been 45% of our kids are in private schools. For the first 20 years, because of all these randomized control trials, we spend all our time in school education on smaller class sizes, teacher salaries, and teacher qualifications. Turns out those three don't matter as much as governance and performance management. Just the fear of falling and the hope of rising for teachers, and just governance of who controls the resources. So now I think we've got over small class sizes and teacher qualifications, and we're doing something in performance management and governance, which I think may show up in another 5 or 10 years.
I'm just going to say one last thing, and then we'll break, because I want to come back to the SME and self-employment, because the essence of diplomacy is constructive ambiguity, in which we say the same word and mean radically different things, so we agree. And the value of academics is destructive precision, right? I think within the development community, there's been this talk of entrepreneurship, right? And there's two meanings to me of entrepreneur. One is you go from small to large. So Manish is an entrepreneur, right? The other meaning of entrepreneur is, fuck you, you're not gonna get a job because our economy isn't generating any jobs, so we'll train you so your self-exploitation will be more effective. And so you'll be a self-employed entrepreneur. That's just mean. Like, to tell a kid, we're going to train you to be an entrepreneur because our economy isn't generating any jobs and you've now just gone through 10 or 12 years of schooling and we can't provide you a standard of living because your productivity isn't high enough, and in order to justify the costs of labor that we've superimposed on, oh, so you're an entrepreneur. I think that's just mean, and the development community has been part of promoting entrepreneurship to mean self-employment, like microfinance. It's like, no. You know, if we're talking about economic growth, I want to talk about the kinds of entrepreneurship that's consistent with and generates economic growth, in which one entrepreneur hires, 100, 500, 4 times the city of Boise where I grew up, but at the outskirts. That's entrepreneurship. And to describe, not that you're doing it and I'm pointing to you, but like even to describe it as self-employment is a little flattering. It's just, you have to do something if there's no social safety net. But it's worse to say, oh, these graduates don't have skills, or our economy isn't generating a job, so we'll create entrepreneurship programs. That's just, that's just, again, and then everyone's like, oh, that's entrepreneurship. No, that's not what we should mean by entrepreneurship, in the sense of entrepreneurship is necessary for a growing, thriving, structural transforming, jobs-creating economy.
So the services versus manufacturing, I just wanted to add that. I think Rohit didn't respond to Arvind. He mischaracterized your book, because India doesn't have to choose between services and manufacturing. We're just too large to make that decision. Popcorn stands like Singapore or something may have to make up their mind. But it's not, we don't have to choose between manufacturing and services. We will do both. We will do both of them hugely. We will do both of them well. And it turns out Apple doesn't manufacture iPhones. It makes them. It doesn't manufacture them. And the difference between services and manufacturing, Mercedes-Benz India isn't only they have 40,000 employees, only 3,000 people make cars, 37,000 people write code. Robert Bosch India, 26,000 people write code, and 2,000 people make spark plugs and other things. So the difference between services and manufacturing, as we traditionally understood it, so much of manufacturing company revenues come from services, so much is embedded code. So I would say this pure distinction between factories, software, who's making, who's manufacturing is blurring, and that actually plays to our advantage, right? I remember many years ago, many economists telling us, oh, global services is only 7 trillion and global manufacturing is 27 trillion, so why is India wasting its time on software? It'll never get there. But turns out that software capability is now driving the 1,800 global capability centers, which are bringing work to India that they wouldn't have outsourced to either IBM or Accenture or to Infosys or Wipro. But Goldman Sachs now has 45,000 employees in Bangalore doing work that they probably would not have given to a firm outside. So I would say from the industrial policy question, the role of the government isn't to set things on fire. It is to create the conditions for spontaneous combustion, if you want to. At least that's how I think about it. So if you love MSMEs, if you fix it for them, you'll fix it for us.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Please join us for refreshments in back, and we start tomorrow at 9 o'clock.